The Sega Genesis, known as the Sega Mega Drive outside the United States, released in 1988 in Japan and 1989 worldwide. The console posed the first true competitor to Nintendo's NES in most of the world, which had seen market dominance since its debut in the States in 1985. Much of Sega's success was due to its brazen marketing strategy, directly challenging the House of Mario with ads such as the infamous Sega Does What Nintendo Don't campaign.
Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does.
For nearly the next decade, Sega didn't shy away from confronting Nintendo, often attempting to prop its blue-haired mascot Sonic as a direct counterpart to the plucky plumber, despite the two not really having much in common. While the Sonic and Mario rivalry was well known and was a major focus of the 90s console wars, what received far less exposure was Sega's attempts at trying to capture the magic of one of Nintendo's other big franchises, The Legend of Zelda. This proved to be much more trying for Sega, as they made numerous attempts at many different titles, all ranging in various forms of success. You had Crusader of Sinti, which looked remarkably like Nintendo's A Link to the Past. The isometric dungeon crawler Landstalker, which sported an elven hero on his search for valuable treasure. And Beyond Oasis, the story of a prince who is tasked with rescuing his kingdom from the grasp of an evil sorcerer. Today, we'll be focusing on that latter title. Known as the Story of Thor in Europe and Asia, Beyond Oasis was developed by Ancient and was the studio's very first original project. Previously, Ancient had been tasked with handling the Game Gear port of the original Sonic, a Genesis port of the arcade game Streets of Rage 2, and assisted in audio production for ActRaiser 2 and RoboTrek on the Super Nintendo. Beyond Oasis came about towards the end of the Genesis lifespan, with the Sega Saturn mere months away from release. Sega had been attempting to cash in on the RPG market, which had flourished in Japan but saw little success in the United States, thus were desperate to acquire any title that fit into the genre and had the chance of making a profit. Not only did Beyond Oasis fit the bill, but its Middle Eastern aesthetic differentiated it enough from the rest of the market, as well as appeal to fans of Disney's Aladdin, which was still a hot item in the US, seeing its first sequel released in 1994, as well as a cartoon television series that lasted through 1995. The game follows Prince Ali.
Prince Ali, fabulous he, Ali Ababa.
Okay, maybe not that one. A treasure-hunting royal who unearths on one of his excursions a mystical golden armlet. A voice from within the gauntlet tells him that it once belonged to a grand wizard, whose spirit now dwells inside, and he sealed his power away so as not to fall into the hands of his arch-nemesis, a dark sorcerer who wields the silver armlet. Ali returns to his kingdom with his treasure, only to find that the evil sorcerer has sensed the golden armlet's awakening, and thus has summoned his minions to attack the kingdom, kill Ali, and retrieve the armlet of gold. Players control Ali as he revives the power within the gauntlet and battles to save his kingdom and destroy the sorcerer once and for all. The general gameplay of Beyond Oasis is very reminiscent of The Legend of Zelda and other adventure RPGs, with the player exploring an overworld for dungeons, unlocking a power within, and defeating a boss before moving on to the next. The Kingdom of Oasis is a treat to explore, even if it is a little small compared to Zelda maps and the like. Still, there are plenty of secrets to be found, paths that can only be unlocked after finding treasures later in the game, and tons of enemies to do battle with. Dungeons progress much the same way. They are a little short and easy comparatively, but they are mostly well designed. making them fun to battle through and explore. There's enough variety here to prevent the player from getting too bored with the environments, from hot deserts to tall mountains, dense forests, and damp caverns. For such a small map, the developers were really able to pack a lot in and make it feel part of a natural world, which is impressive. One of the first things players may notice when playing Beyond Oasis is how different the battle system is here compared to other adventure RPG titles. Ancient has used their background in porting Streets of Rage 2 to incorporate beat-em-up style controls into the combat, creating a unique and satisfying experience, albeit with all the flaws of the beat-em-up genre has. Instead of simple swipes of his weapon, Ali will chain together combos when attacking enemies, throwing in kicks and throws along with slashes of his dagger. Players can also run up and charge into enemies, crouch and attack foes at their ankles, and even jump and deliver satisfying drop kicks, like in every beat-em-up ever. For the most part, this works, with battles feeling more like rough street brawls rather than valiant battles between knights, which is what I think the developers were aiming for. Beat-em-up is far from a perfect genre, however, and unfortunately Beyond Oasis borrows those problems too. For starters, combat can get rather repetitive when spread across an 8-hour campaign. This may be short for an RPG, but for an action title, it can really wear out its welcome. Secondly, there aren't many moves for Ali to pull off, making the brawling combat feel even more of a bore towards the later stages of the game. In games like Zelda, the hero has numerous weapons and items at his disposal, making for more varied and enjoyable combat. Here, Ali does pick up some weapons, but the majority of the moves that he uses remain the same. There are a few special attacks one can perform, but there's no real explanation of how to pull these maneuvers off, like this twirling jump slash. It doesn't do as much damage as one would think considering the flare, and I never once could do it reliably. Often I would do it when I didn't want to, or wasn't prepared for it, leaving me vulnerable to attack. Beyond Oasis at least features a decent amount of enemies to beat up on, though like in most other areas, it's a bit stunted when compared to its Nintendo counterpart. You have your standard knights, bats, snakes, and wizards all attacking generally how you would expect them to. A nice twist is that for bats, it's much easier to jump and knock them out of the air, while with snakes and other ground foes, you must crouch in order to hit them reliably. It's not a huge thing, but enough to give the encounters some variety. What's more impressive are larger enemies such as ogres or heavy knights, which are intimidating thanks to the large, detailed graphics of the game. These foes would be colossal bosses in a Zelda title, so it's nice to see them as standard enemies here. Speaking of bosses, Beyond Oasis does a good job of making these fights feel epic in their own right. The monsters are usually much larger than those found in other games, and to defeat them, you have to use a good deal of problem solving coupled with combat. It's always satisfying when you discover a massive enemy's weakness after several attempts, and then exploit it and wail on him until he explodes into a million pixelated chunks. In order to exploit these weaknesses and to solve puzzles, players will have to use the summoning power of the Golden Armlet. There are 4 elemental spirits that Ali can unlock, each coming equipped with their own special abilities. The Water Spirit is a fairy that can heal you, shoot bubble projectiles, and transform into a tornado that flies about the room, hitting foes randomly as she goes. The Fire Spirit is a genie that can blow fire and explode, causing massive damage to the foes of his vicinity. The Shadow Spirit creates a double of Ali, absorbing damage that the prince takes and allows Ali's attack to often strike twice, dealing extra damage. He can also stretch out to cross gaps and grab out-of-reach items, which is extremely helpful. Lastly, there is the Plant Spirit, who remains stationary but can chomp down on baddies that get too close. He can also destroy barriers blocking Ali's way, and is paramount in getting into many rooms late in the game. To summon these spirits, Ali must use the armlet near a source of their elemental powers. For example, using it on a burning campfire will summon the Fire Spirit, while looking into a mirror will beckon the shadow spirit, and so on. It's a great way of limiting the player's abilities without it feeling forced and cheap, and it allows for a great deal of puzzle solving when trying to find out how to bring about that one spirit that you know you need. I will say, I would have loved to have had the shadow and plant spirit for a longer period of time. You acquire them far too late in the game for you to make the most of them, and I think a few more dungeons towards the end could have allowed the player to get more acquainted with them. Also, it can be downright irritating how randomly the fire and water spirits move about after you summon them. Often you need to use their abilities on a particular object or enemy, but it can be a huge chore to maneuver them right into the spot that you need. And it's even worse when their attack misses because they were a pixel or two off. Having more direct control over the summons could have made the game much more tolerable in difficult sections. Beyond Oasis also includes some platforming sections. These can be really troublesome due to how slippery Ollie's jumping can be. It's far too easy to overjump a small platform because you can't really control Ollie in the air, or jump too short because he didn't have enough room for a running start. Sticking a landing even after you've judged the distance right can also be a headache. After jumping from a sprint, Ollie will naturally slide a few feet, which will often cause him to careen off the edge. These sections need a lot of work, but thankfully they are few and far between and don't detract from the game too much. While it's easy to compare Beyond Oasis with any of the first 4 Zelda titles that had been released at the time, it surprisingly has a lot in common with the most recent, Breath of the Wild. Like in Breath of the Wild, the player will amass quite the inventory of weapons, and all but Ollie's default short dagger can break upon use. These include longswords, crossbows, and throwable bombs. The best strategy is to save powerful weapons for the more challenging enemies, though it can be tempting to use them on smaller foes and clear a room with relative ease. You'll also be finding a lot of food items to use for health, as the majority of healing isn't done with potions or spells. There isn't a cooking element to the game, which I think could have added a lot more depth, but it's interesting to see a wide range of consumables, such as cheeses and meats, each with their own curative properties. The music in the game is very Sega, with that heavy bass and synthetic sound that has come to define the system. Composed by the acclaimed Yuzo Koshiro, once regarded by Nintendo Power magazine as the greatest game composer in the 16-bit age, the score shines as a memorable album on the Sega Genesis. Dungeons and forests have an appropriate ambient sound to them, even with the heavy electronic sound of the Genesis sound card. Thus, it comes across as surprisingly fitting for a fantasy title. Some tracks even consist of an eerie distortion to the music, which makes dungeon romping even more exciting and perilous, as you wonder, what will you encounter next? The sound in the combat is also stellar, which is always a plus in a beat-em-up. It's hard to explain, but that satisfying oomph when hitting and defeating enemies helps elevate the action to a higher level. Lastly, you can't talk about Beyond Oasis without talking about its colorful graphics and large sprites. By this point in the Genesis's lifespan, the console was certainly showing its age, with Nintendo utilizing the incredible Super FX chip to create awe-inspiring graphics in games like Donkey Kong Country and Star Fox. Still, Beyond Oasis does a great job of bringing its world and story alive with its pleasing aesthetics. Characters are large, bright, and well animated, sometimes giving an almost Disney quality to their wide range of expressions. There are also several cinematics that populate the title, creating an impressive and exciting visual aid that complements the story being told. Does Beyond Oasis succeed in dethroning Zelda? In short, no, it doesn't. But it does offer an entertaining adventure RPG that is worth checking out even if you're a Nintendo diehard. The game can be played in a multitude of ways today. While the Wii Virtual Console re-release is no longer available, it was featured in the Sonic Ultimate Genesis Collection on PS3 and Xbox 360, and on the Sega Forever service available on iOS and Android mobile devices, as well as Steam. The game was also featured on the Sega Genesis Mini Classic, released in September of 2019. A prequel, The Legend of Oasis, released on the Sega Saturn in 1996, and while I haven't played it, I'm more than eager to try it out one of these days. I definitely feel that the series has a lot of potential, and hopefully one day, Sega returns to explore the adventures of Prince Ali, Fabulous He, Ali Ababwa. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. It'll really help me a lot in determining what content to create in the future. For other video game related content and to see what's coming next, check out my Twitter, Facebook, and Twitch. Also consider donating to my Patreon page. Your donations will definitely help me grow this channel and allow me to provide you with more content in a more timely manner. Again, thank you for watching, and take care, everyone.